At 2:15 in the morning on August 1st, 1943, Private First Class Virgil Mercer sat in a mud-soaked foxhole on the island of New Georgia, staring into the impenetrable black wall of the jungle 50 yards away. The air hung thick and wet, heavy as a wool blanket soaked in sweat and fear. It smelled of rotting vegetation mildew that never dried and the faint metallic tang of ammunition that hadn't been fired yet. The kind of smell that gets into your clothes, your skin, your lungs, and stays there long after you've left the jungle behind, if you leave at all. Virgil's hands rested on a rifle that didn't belong in this war, not according to the experts, not according to his commanding officer, not according to anyone who knew anything about modern combat. It was a Winchester Model 54, bolt action, chambered in .220 Swift. A varmint gun designed for shooting prairie dogs across the flat grasslands of Illinois, not for stopping 200 screaming Japanese soldiers in the darkness of the Solomon Islands. In the past 3 weeks, 18 American soldiers in this sector had died during banzai charges. Not because they ran out of ammunition, because they couldn't shoot fast enough to stop the momentum of men who believed dying for the Emperor was the highest honor a human being could achieve. Virgil was about to bet his life that everyone who laughed at his varmint gun was wrong. The Winchester felt cold in his hands despite the oppressive heat. The stock was walnut hand-fitted and worn smooth from years of use. This rifle had been his father's, Augustus Mercer, Gus to his friends. A man who came back from the First War with a purple heart, a limp that never quite healed, and a quiet, unshakable belief that most experts didn't understand what really happened when bullets hit flesh. Gus Mercer died in December of 1941, 3 days before Pearl Harbor. The doctors said it was complications from mustard gas he'd breathed in the trenches of France. Virgil knew his father had been dying slowly for 2 decades, one labored breath at a time, his lungs turning to scar tissue, while he taught his son how to shoot. The Winchester was the only thing Gus left behind, besides a grave in the Bloomington Town Cemetery. And a promise. Virgil was 8 years old, the first time his father put a rifle in his hands. Not this one. A .22 rimfire light enough for a boy to hold steady. They'd walked out to the back 40 of the farm in early morning, when mist still clung to the cornfields, and the world felt clean and new. Gus showed him how to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, controlled. How to let the crosshairs settle naturally instead of forcing them. How to squeeze the trigger like you were trying not to wake a sleeping baby. The jackrabbit had been 70 yards away, sitting up ears tall. Virgil remembered the way the rifle kicked against his small shoulder, the way the rabbit simply folded over sideways, dead before it knew what happened. His father's hand on his shoulder. Heavy, warm, proud. That was 1930. The first year of the Great Depression, when half the farms in McLean County were failing, and families were learning what real hunger felt like. For the next 11 years, Virgil hunted, not for sport, for survival. Rabbits, squirrels, coyotes when they got into the chicken coop. His mother would skin whatever he brought home because there wasn't money for beef or pork from the butcher in town. By 16, Virgil could hit a tin can at 300 yards with his father's Winchester. By 18, he was Illinois State Junior Marksmanship Champion. By 19, his father was in the hospital drowning in his own lungs, and Virgil was sitting beside the bed listening to the old man's final words. Gus Mercer's voice had been a wet whisper. Each word cost him. They'll tell you that big bullets are better. Heavy, slow, punch through anything. A long, rattling breath. They're wrong. Virgil had leaned closer. Speed, Virg. Speed does things mass can't. You take that Winchester to war. You show them I was right. Promise me. Virgil had promised. 3 days later, his father was dead. 6 months after that, Virgil was in basic training with the Winchester, hidden in his footlocker, and every drill sergeant who saw it told him the same thing Gus Mercer had heard in 1918. Wrong gun, wrong war. Leave it behind. Now, on this miserable island, sitting in mud that smelled like death, Virgil was about to find out if his father had been right. The jungle ahead was silent. Not normal nighttime silence. This was different. Wrong. The insects had stopped chirping. The frogs had stopped croaking. Even the distant surf seemed muted, as if the whole island was holding its breath. Every man in Charlie Company knew what that meant. The Japanese were moving into position. Virgil thought about Leland Kowalski. Lee had been 19. Polish kid from Chicago who talked too much, laughed too loud, and played harmonica every night until the sergeants told him to shut up. He'd been in Virgil's platoon for exactly 8 days before a Japanese sniper put a bullet through his throat during a routine patrol on July 18th. Lee died in 4 seconds, long enough to look surprised, long enough to reach for his neck with both hands, not long enough to say anything. That death had been fast, clean in its own terrible way. Roscoe Delacroix's death had been something else entirely. July 24th, late afternoon. 30 Japanese soldiers came out of the jungle without warning, screaming, bayonets fixed, running straight at the American line. Roscoe Delacroix had been 20 years old, Louisiana boy, Creole heritage, skin the color of deep brewed coffee. He had a girlfriend back home named Marie, who wrote him letters that smelled like perfume. When the charge hit, Roscoe did exactly what he'd been trained to do. He raised his M1 Garand and fired. The M1 made a distinctive sound. Ping, 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 ping. Rhythmic, mechanical, reliable. Roscoe fired all 8 rounds in less than 4 seconds. Virgil watched from 15 feet away. He saw Roscoe hit 3 different Japanese soldiers. Center mass. Good shots. Exactly where the training manual said to aim. All 3 men staggered. Blood bloomed on their uniforms. They should have gone down. They didn't. The bullets punched clean through. In one side, out the other. Neat holes. The wounded men didn't stop, didn't slow. Just kept running because adrenaline and fanaticism can keep a man upright for 10, 15, sometimes 20 seconds after he's been shot through the chest. Long enough to cover 30 yards. Long enough to use a bayonet. Virgil had fired twice with his Winchester. 2 Japanese soldiers. 2 instant drops, like someone cut their strings. But Virgil's 2 kills didn't save Roscoe. While Roscoe was reloading, fumbling with the N-block clip hands, shaking one of the wounded Japanese soldiers he'd shot in the chest, made it to the American line. Virgil saw the bayonet go in, saw it punch through Roscoe's abdomen just below the ribs, saw the Japanese soldier twist it before Virgil's 3rd shot dropped him. Roscoe fell backward into the mud. He didn't die right away. The medic came running. Did everything right. Pressure bandages, morphine. Called for an evacuation that would never come in time. The wound was bad. The bayonet had perforated intestines, nicked an artery. There was too much blood soaking into the volcanic soil, turning everything dark and wet. Roscoe's breathing changed. Wet. Rattling. He was bleeding internally, drowning from the inside. Virgil knelt beside him, held his hand, because there was nothing else to do. Roscoe's eyes were open, clear. He was conscious, aware. He knew exactly what was happening to him. "Virg," he whispered, blood coming with the word. "Can't breathe right. Medic's here. You're gonna be fine." But they both knew that was a lie. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of wet, labored breathing. 40 minutes of his eyes getting wider, more frightened as his body slowly shut down. 40 minutes of Virgil holding his hand and feeling the grip get weaker until there was nothing left. In the last few seconds, Roscoe looked at Virgil, really looked at him. "Your gun, Virg. Your Winchester. It stopped them. Right away. They just dropped." Then the light went out of his eyes. Virgil sat there in the mud next to Roscoe's body and understood something that all the experts in their clean offices back in Washington didn't. The M1 Garand was magnificent. 8 rounds of .30-06 Springfield. Semi-automatic. The finest standard infantry rifle in the world. But it had one flaw against Banzai charges. The 150-grain bullet, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, punched clean through a human body. In one side, out the other. 7mm hole going in, maybe 10mm coming out. The bullet carried so much momentum that it just kept going, taking most of its energy with it. The wounded could still fight for 10-15 seconds, long enough to close 30 yards with a bayonet. The Winchester .220 Swift was different. Virgil's father had taught him why. A 48-grain bullet screaming out of the barrel at 400 feet per second didn't just penetrate, it created something the experts called hydrostatic shock. When a bullet moved that fast, tissue couldn't get out of the way in time. The impact created a pressure wave that radiated outward like dropping a rock in water, except the water was human flesh and organs. The temporary wound cavity was 10 times the size of the bullet itself. Everything in a 6-inch radius around the wound channel got crushed by pure hydraulic pressure. Instant nervous system shutdown. No death sprint, no final charge, just lights out. The experts at Aberdeen Proving Ground had tested every rifle, every cartridge, every possible configuration. They'd concluded the .30-06 was optimal. Gus Mercer, a farm boy who never went to college, had known better. And now Virgil was going to prove it. He made a decision that night. Not rational, not following regulations or common sense or the advice of men with doctoral degrees. He was not going to watch another friend die slowly because his weapon couldn't create an instant stop. 3 days before the Banzai charge, Captain Robert Blackwood called Virgil into his tent. Blackwood was 38, West Point class of 1927. 15 years in the peacetime army, studying doctrine, following procedures, climbing officer ranks with the methodical precision of a man who believed the system worked because it was designed by people smarter than him. His office smelled like canvas and mosquito repellent and stale air. A map of New Georgia was tacked to a corkboard. Casualty reports covered his desk. 11 names he'd had to write letters home about. "Private Mercer," he said without looking up. "Sergeant Torres tells me you're still carrying that Winchester." "Yes, sir." Blackwood looked up. His eyes were grey, tired. "I gave you a direct order to leave that rifle behind and carry the standard issue M1 Garand. Do you remember that order?" "Yes, sir." "Then why are you disobeying it?" Virgil kept his eyes forward. "Sir, Private Delacroix died because we're at war." Blackwood's voice was sharp, cutting. "Not because of his rifle. Because the Japanese Empire decided to conquer the Pacific and young men like Roscoe Delacroix have to die to stop them. That's war, Mercer. It's not about gear. It's about violence and death, and there's no rifle in the world that changes that fundamental equation." He stood up, walked around the desk, stood directly in front of Virgil. "You know how many soldiers I've lost because of non-standard equipment? 3. 3 men who thought they knew better than the system. One had a pistol that jammed because he was using wrong ammunition. One had a scope that fogged in humidity. One had a bolt-action rifle that failed to feed in a firefight. Do you know what happened to those 3 men? No, sir. They died, slowly, screaming for help that couldn't save them." Blackwood picked up a manual from his desk. Technical Manual 9-1005-222-10. The entire doctrine of American infantry combat in 300 pages. This manual was written by experts at Aberdeen Proving Ground, engineers with doctoral degrees, men who've spent 20-30 years studying ballistics. They tested every rifle, every cartridge. They concluded that the M1 Garand with .30-06 ammunition is optimal for the modern infantry soldier. He dropped the manual on the desk with a thud. "You're 21 years old, Mercer, a farm boy from Illinois with a high school education, and you think you know better than the finest weapons engineers in the United States Army? My father. Your father is dead." The words hung in the air like smoke, cold, factual, cruel in their honesty. "I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but your father is not here. You are, and I need soldiers who follow orders." Blackwood sat down, looked at Virgil with something that might have been sympathy mixed with exhaustion. "Lose the Winchester, Private. That's an order. Carry the M1 Garand. If you disobey again, you'll face court-martial. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Dismissed." Virgil saluted, walked out of the tent into the oppressive heat. He walked directly to his foxhole. He did not retrieve the M1 Garand. That night, by the light of a hooded flashlight, Virgil prepared for war the only way his father had taught him. He prepared his ammunition. The 50 rounds of .220 Swift were hand loads. Ammunition Virgil had assembled himself back in Illinois in the basement workshop where his father had spent countless hours doing the same thing. Hand loading was a craft, an art. The difference between ammunition that worked and ammunition that killed you was measured in fractions of a grain of gunpowder in thousandths of an inch of bullet-seating depth in the integrity of brass that would contain 60,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. Get it wrong and the rifle explodes in your hands. Virgil sat in his foxhole and began the ritual. Step 1. Inspect the brass casings, each one individually under dim flashlight, looking for cracks, hairline fractures that would propagate under pressure, looking for dents, deformations that would affect chambering, looking for corrosion. Each case had been fired before. Reloading brass was standard for hand loaders, but each firing stressed the metal. Eventually, every case reached the end of its useful life. Virgil had brought 60 cases to New Georgia. He'd already rejected 10. Now he examined the remaining 50 with meticulous care a watchmaker might use on gears. The light was terrible. Humidity made everything stick to his fingers. Sweat dripped onto the cloth. He didn't rush. One bad case meant one rifle explosion. He found 2 cases with microscopic cracks. Set them aside. 48 good cases remaining. Step 2. Measure the gunpowder charge. This was where precision became critical. The .220 Swift operated at the edge of safe pressure limits. Too little powder, the bullet wouldn't achieve velocity needed for hydrostatic shock. Too much, the brass would rupture. The correct charge was 28.5 grains of IMR 4064 powder. Not 28.4, not 28.6, exactly 28.5. Virgil used a simple balance beam scale with weights fashioned from filed-down uniform buttons. Crude, improvised, all he had. He poured powder grain by grain, watched the beam balance. When it hung perfectly level, he funneled the powder into the brass case. 48 times he repeated this process. His hands cramped. His back ached from hunching over. The flashlight battery died, the beam growing dimmer. He didn't stop, because 0.5 grains of error could mean the difference between a bullet that performed and a rifle that turned into a grenade. Step 3. Seat the bullets. The 48-grain hollow points had to be seated to exactly the right depth. Too deep powder would compress, raising pressure dangerously. Too shallow, the cartridge wouldn't chamber. The correct overall length was 2.680 inches, measured from case base to bullet tip. Using a hand press the size of pliers, he seated each bullet with firm, steady pressure, measured with calipers his father had given him for his 16th birthday. 2.681 inches. Close, but not exact. He adjusted. Tried again. 2.679 inches. Better. Third try, 2.680 inches precisely. He locked the die and seated the remaining 45 bullets. Step 4. Crimp the case mouth. Light crimp to hold the bullet firmly and prevent it from shifting under recoil. Too much crimp hurt accuracy. Too little, the bullet could shift during chambering. When he finished, the sun was lightening the eastern horizon. 3 hours of work. 48 rounds of .220 Swift ammunition, each one assembled by hand, each one perfect, each one potentially the difference between living and dying. He loaded 5 rounds into the Winchester's internal magazine, worked the bolt. The action moved like silk. The rifle was ready. Now he just had to wait for the war to come to him. It came at 2:30 a.m. on July 31st. Not the main assault, just a probe, a scout, one man moving through darkness testing the American perimeter. Virgil saw him through the scope. A shadow against shadows, moving low, careful, professional. 180 yards away. The distance was perfect. Close enough that atmospheric conditions didn't matter. Far enough that the bullet would still be traveling over 3,800 feet per second on impact. Virgil controlled his breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, measured, the way his father had taught him. The crosshairs settled on center mass, just below where the scout's sternum would be. His finger found the trigger. 3 pounds of pressure. Custom work his father had done years ago. Light, crisp, predictable. He took one more breath. Let half out. Held. His heartbeat pounded. Thump, thump, thump. He waited for the natural pause between beats. Thump, pause, squeeze. The Winchester cracked, sharp. The recoil pushed back against his shoulder. Light, manageable. The bullet left the barrel at 450 feet per second. Invisible. A 48-grain projectile moving faster than comprehension. It covered 180 yards in 0.13 seconds. Through the scope, Virgil saw the impact. The Japanese scout didn't fall, didn't stumble, didn't cry out. He just stopped, froze in place like a paused film. Then he collapsed. Forward, face first, no attempt to catch himself, no death throes, complete instant shutdown. Virgil worked the bolt. The spent brass ejected with a soft clink. He pushed the bolt forward, chambering the next round. Less than a second. Smooth, practiced, automatic. Through the scope, the body wasn't moving, not breathing, not twitching. Absolutely, completely still. One shot, one kill, instant stop. Exactly what his father had promised. 15 feet to Virgil's left, Corporal James Stavros had been watching through night vision binoculars. Stavros was 32, Greek immigrant, Brooklyn accent. He'd seen enough combat to know the difference between luck and something else. He'd seen the Japanese scout moving, seen him freeze, seen him drop. Hadn't heard Virgil's shot. He keyed his radio, whispered. "Mercer, did you just fire?" Virgil's voice came back calm. "Affirmative. Scout. 180 yards. One shot." "Is he down?" "Confirmed." Stavros lowered the binoculars. "He's not moving at all, Mercer. Not even twitching. What did that little bullet do to him?" Virgil's voice carried something that might have been vindication. "What it was designed to do, Corporal." At first light, Stavros crossed to Virgil's foxhole. "I want to see." They went together, carefully, watching for snipers, booby traps, any sign the probe had been more than one man. The scout was lying face down, partially hidden by ferns. Young, maybe 17, wearing a patched uniform and boots falling apart. Stavros rolled the body over. The entry wound was small, smaller than a pencil eraser, just below the sternum. Very little external bleeding. But when Stavros opened the uniform jacket, the damage became apparent. Internal trauma was catastrophic. Ribs broken from the inside out, organs pulverized. The temporary wound cavity had crushed everything in a 6-inch radius. Stavros had seen plenty of bullet wounds. .30-06 wounds looked like tunnels, clean tissue damage along the path. This looked like someone had detonated a small explosive inside the scout's chest. "Jesus Christ," Stavros said quietly. He looked at Virgil. "Your little varmint gun did this. Pressure wave from the bullet speed. Tissue can't move out of the way in time. I've never seen anything like this." Stavros stood, looked back toward the American line. "Made a decision that could get both of them in trouble." "Good," he finally said. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. I don't care what the manual says. This works." That evening, Captain Blackwood made his rounds, checking positions, making sure everyone was ready for the attack intelligence said was coming within 48 hours. He stopped at Virgil's foxhole. Virgil was cleaning the Winchester. The bolt was disassembled on a cloth. Blackwood looked at the rifle, looked at Virgil. His jaw tightened. "Private Mercer." Virgil stood, came to attention. "Sir, that's the Winchester I ordered you to leave behind." "Yes, sir. You understand that disobeying a direct order in a combat zone is grounds for court-martial?" "Yes, sir." Blackwood stared at him. The silence stretched, heavy. Then in the distance, Japanese artillery opened up. Shells screamed overhead, impacting 400 yards north. Illumination flares burst, turning night into artificial day. Blackwood's radio crackled. Urgent voices reporting movement, enemy staging for assault. He looked at Virgil one more time. "After the battle," he said. "We'll discuss this after the battle. Until then, Private, you hold this position." "Yes, sir." Blackwood turned and walked toward the command post, his silhouette flickering in distant explosions. Virgil sat back down, reassembled the Winchester, loaded 5 fresh rounds. The battle was coming, and when it arrived, he'd prove once and for all that the experts were wrong. At 3 o'clock in the morning on August 1st, 1943, the jungle silence shattered. The sound came from everywhere at once, a collective roar that seemed to rise from the earth itself, hundreds of voices screaming a single word: "Banzai!" Then they came. 200 Japanese soldiers emerged from the black wall of vegetation like a human avalanche, bayonets fixed, grenades clutched, eyes burning with the kind of fanaticism that made death irrelevant. They weren't running. They were flowing. A living wave of desperate violence aimed at overwhelming through sheer momentum and terror. Charlie Company's machine guns opened up immediately. Heavy Browning .30 caliber positions erupted in rhythmic thunder. Tracers arced through darkness like deadly fireflies crisscrossing the kill zone. The sound was overwhelming, deafening, the kind that turned thought into instinct. But the charge didn't stop. Japanese soldiers fell, dozens, cut down by machine gun fire. But the men behind kept coming, climbing over bodies, screaming louder, getting closer. 50 yards from the American line, 40, 30. Virgil Mercer sat in his foxhole and became a machine. His world narrowed to the circle of glass at the end of his scope. 4 power magnification. A window that showed him not chaos, but individual targets. Individual men who needed to die in a very specific order. Not the ones in front. Those would hit the machine gun fire, the leaders. The ones directing the assault. The ones whose deaths would cause confusion. 300 yards out, Virgil saw him. A Japanese officer, taller than the men around him, moving with purpose. A sword raised above his head, catching tracer light. His mouth open, screaming orders that kept the charge organized. "Kill the head." The body falters. Virgil's crosshairs settled on center mass. The officer was running at an angle, moving left to right. Led the target. Account for movement. Account for bullet flight time. The trigger broke. The Winchester cracked. The .220 swift bullet crossed 300 yards in 0.22 seconds. Through the scope, Virgil watched the officer's chest explode internally. The hydrostatic shockwave didn't just kill, it destroyed. Liquefied organs, shattered ribs from inside out. The officer didn't fall forward, he fell backward, violently, like someone had yanked him with an invisible rope. His sword flew from his hand, tumbling into darkness. The soldiers behind him hesitated, just for a second, just long enough to look down to try to understand. That second was all Virgil needed. He worked the bolt, smooth, fast, spent brass ejected, Fresh round chambered, less than a second. Muscle memory. 250 yards out, he saw the next threat. 2 Japanese soldiers carrying a Type 92 heavy machine gun. The woodpecker. If they got that weapon set up, they'd rake the American foxholes from an angle the Brownings couldn't cover. They were moving fast. Bent, low. The lead gunner had the weapon's body across his shoulders. The second carried the tripod. Virgil aimed for the neck. Softest target. Most lethal. Shot number 2. The lead gunner's head snapped sideways. His body followed. The heavy machine gun fell crashing into mud. The second gunner froze, looked at his partner, looked around wildly. He was still looking when Virgil killed him. Shot number 3. Another neck shot. Clean. Surgical. Instant. 2 men dead. The Type 92 lying useless in mud. Time elapsed 4 seconds. The Banzai charge was fragmenting. Machine gun fire tearing into front ranks. Bodies piling up. The wave that had seemed unstoppable was beginning to break apart. But they weren't retreating. 200 yards out, Virgil saw a squad of 3 riflemen trying to flank left, using terrain for concealment. Moving tactically. Smart. Dangerous. If they got around the American line, they'd have clear shots into foxholes from the side. Virgil swung the Winchester left, found the first man in his scope. Shot 4. Center mass. Drop. The bolt cycled. Smooth. His left hand working the action while his right maintained firing grip. Shot 5. The second flanker, trying to dive for cover. Too slow. Drop. Shot 6. The third man, already prone. Harder target. Virgil aimed for the shoulder. Largest visible mass. Drop. 3 shots. 4 seconds. 3 bodies. The Winchester's internal magazine was empty. This was the vulnerability of bolt-action rifles, the reload, the seconds when you weren't a threat. Virgil's hands moved without thought. His left hand pulled 5 fresh rounds from his ammunition pouch. His right thumb pushed them down into the magazine. 5 metallic clicks. His palm slapped the bolt closed. Chambered. Ready. Total reload time 3 seconds. 150 yards out, a Japanese soldier stood up from cover. Virgil saw the distinctive shape. Type 97 hand grenade. The thrower was cocking his arm back, preparing to launch toward Virgil's foxhole. This shot was measured in fractions of a second. If the grenade left the thrower's hand, Virgil would have 4 seconds before it exploded. Not enough time to escape. Virgil didn't aim for center mass. He aimed for the arm, the shoulder joint, where the grenade was clutched. Shot 7. The .220 Swift hit the soldier's shoulder with devastating force. The arm cocking back snapped forward involuntarily. The grenade fell. Not toward the American line, straight down, at the thrower's feet. The explosion was immediate, close range, catastrophic. The thrower disappeared in a flash of fire and shrapnel. 2 soldiers standing near him went down, shredded by the blast. 1 bullet, 3 casualties. The charge was breaking now, truly breaking. Men were turning, running back toward the jungle. The wave that had seemed infinite a minute ago was collapsing into scattered groups trying to survive. But the closest ones were only 50 yards away, close enough to throw grenades, close enough to make a final sprint. Virgil found them in his scope. 3 men, still moving forward, still committed even as everyone around them retreated. Shot 8, 100 yards, center mass, drop. Shot 9, 80 yards, neck shot, drop. Shot 10, 60 yards. This soldier had seen where the shots were coming from, was raising his rifle trying to return fire while running. Virgil put crosshairs on his chest and fired. The man's legs kept moving for 2 steps after his nervous system shut down. Then he collapsed mid-stride. The Winchester was empty again. Virgil reloaded. 5 more rounds, the last of his immediately available ammunition. The battlefield had transformed. What had been a coordinated assault 90 seconds ago was now a rout. Japanese soldiers fleeing back into jungle. Bodies littered the ground. But 2 soldiers, braver or more desperate than the rest, made one final attempt to break through on Virgil's left flank. 40 yards out, running fast, low, zigzagging, close enough that Virgil could see their faces. Young faces. Terrified faces. Shot 11. The lead runner. Virgil aimed low for the pelvis. The shot shattered bone, dropping the soldier instantly. Shot 12. The second man. He'd seen his partner fall, was trying to change direction. Too late. Virgil's bullet caught him mid-turn. He spun completely around and fell face first. Then silence. Not complete silence. There were moans from wounded in the kill zone, distant shouts from the jungle, continuing chatter of machine guns firing into the tree line. But the charge was over. Broken. Shattered. Turned back. Virgil lowered the Winchester. His hands were shaking. Adrenaline. His shoulder ached from recoil. His ears rang. He looked at the spent brass scattered around his foxhole, counted them in the growing dawn light. 12. 12 rounds fired. 4 minutes and 38 seconds of combat. 10 men dead by his hand. Maybe more if the grenade and neck shots had been as effective as they looked. He'd stopped a battalion-sized banzai charge with a varmint gun. The sun broke over the horizon at 6:15 in the morning. Captain Robert Blackwood walked the battlefield with the slow, measured pace of a man inspecting a massacre. Bodies lay everywhere, most killed by machine gun fire. Multiple impacts. Torn uniforms, the kind of damage heavy .30 caliber rounds produced. But in one sector, directly in front of Private Mercer's foxhole, the bodies looked different. Blackwood counted them. 10 Japanese soldiers, all within a 150-yard arc centered on Virgil's position. He knelt beside the first body, the officer with the sword. The entry wound was small, almost insignificant, a tiny hole just below the sternum. Blackwood had seen hundreds of bullet wounds. .30-06 wounds were tunnels. The bullet went in, traveled through, exited out the back. He rolled the officer over. There was no exit wound. The bullet had fragmented inside, dumping all its energy. He opened the officer's uniform jacket. What he saw made him stop breathing. The internal damage was incomprehensible. Ribs broken from the inside out. Organs that looked like they'd been put through a blender. A wound cavity that extended 6 inches in every direction from the bullet's path. This wasn't a rifle wound. This was devastation. Blackwood stood, walked to the next body, opened the uniform. Same catastrophic internal damage. The next body. Same. All 10. Same pattern. Small entry wound. No exit. Massive internal destruction. He walked back to Virgil's foxhole slowly. His mind was at war with itself. 20 years in the army. 20 years of following doctrine, trusting the system, believing that men with degrees and laboratories knew better than men with rifles and mud. And in 5 minutes, a farm boy had shattered that belief. Not with arguments, with bodies, 10 of them. Each one killed more efficiently than anything Blackwood had seen in 2 years of Pacific combat. He thought about the letter he'd written to Division just last week, requesting more M1 Garans, praising the .30-06 as optimal. He thought about the 3 soldiers he'd lost to non-standard equipment, the justification he'd used for every order he'd given. And he thought about the 18 men who died in banzai charges because their weapons couldn't create instant stops. The math was brutal and clear. He'd been wrong, and his being wrong had cost lives. Virgil was sitting on the edge of his foxhole rifle across his lap, staring at nothing. His face was streaked with mud and powder residue. His eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd just killed more people in 5 minutes than most soldiers killed in an entire war. "Private Mercer," Blackwood said quietly. "Report." Virgil stood, came to attention on automatic pilot. His voice was flat, emotionless. 12 rounds expended, sir. Winchester model 54.220 Swift cartridge. 10 confirmed kills. Charge broken in this sector at 0304 hours. Blackwood looked at the Winchester, then at the tiny pile of spent brass casings in the mud. He picked one up, held it in his palm. Absurdly small, delicate, the kind of cartridge you'd use to shoot squirrels. "This little round did that." He gestured toward the field of bodies. "Yes, sir. The bullet velocity creates a pressure wave in soft tissue that—" "I know what it does, Private." Blackwood dropped the brass. It landed soundlessly in mud. "What I don't know is how a 21-year-old farm boy figured out something that the finest weapons engineers in the United States Army apparently missed." "My father taught me, sir." "Your father?" "Yes, sir. He used the same principle in the First War. Said speed mattered more than mass if you knew where to hit." Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. Behind them, the company was consolidating positions, treating wounded, counting their own dead. "You disobeyed a direct order, Private Mercer." "Yes, sir." "You risked court-martial." "Yes, sir." "You probably saved this entire sector, possibly saved the company." Virgil didn't respond, didn't know how to. Blackwood looked at the Winchester one more time, then at the bodies, then at Virgil. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "The experts at Aberdeen were wrong. The entire doctrine was wrong. Sometimes the system fails, and sometimes a farm boy from Illinois knows better than all the PhDs in Maryland combined." He turned to leave, stopped, looked back. "Keep the Winchester, Private. That's an order." The word spread through Charlie Company like wildfire. Mercer's varmint gun had held the line. Within 2 days, 3 other soldiers asked to see the Winchester. Examine it. Understand how a bolt-action hunting rifle had achieved what semi-automatic M1 Garans couldn't. Captain Blackwood filed an official after-action report. He included specific details about the .220 Swift's effectiveness, the instant stops, the wound characteristics, the tactical advantage of a weapon that eliminated threats before they could react. He recommended that high-velocity lightweight cartridges be evaluated for specialized infantry roles, particularly for situations where instant incapacitation was critical. The report went up the chain of command: Division, Corps, Army. By November of 1943, it reached Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. They dispatched an evaluation team to New Georgia in December. The team spent 2 weeks on the island. Senior engineers, career researchers, men whose reputations were built on being the smartest people in the room. They collected spent brass casings, examined Japanese bodies that had been preserved for medical analysis, ran ballistic calculations, but they never interviewed Virgil Mercer. Not because they didn't know about him. Blackwood's report had named him explicitly, but interviewing Virgil would mean acknowledging that a private with no engineering degree had discovered something they'd missed, that a farm boy using hand-loaded ammunition had solved a problem their laboratory testing had failed to identify. Institutional ego couldn't survive that admission. So they took Virgil's data, his field observations, his combat results. They ran it through their own tests in controlled laboratory conditions, verified the physics, confirmed the ballistics, and then they published it under their own names. Not maliciously, just conveniently, the way institutions always protect themselves. In January of 1944, Aberdeen Proving Ground issued an official report. The report concluded that high-velocity, lightweight projectiles demonstrated superior terminal ballistics in soft tissue targets through a mechanism identified as hydrostatic shock. The temporary wound cavity created by supersonic projectiles traveling in excess of 3,800 feet per second produced immediate incapacitation superior to conventional military ammunition. The report recommended further evaluation of high-velocity cartridges for specialized applications. The report was filed with official attribution to the Aberdeen Proving Ground Small Arms Research Division. Private First Class Virgil Mercer's name appeared nowhere in the document. Captain Blackwood read the report in his tent on a rainy February afternoon. Read it twice to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding. He wrote a letter of protest to division headquarters. The letter detailed Virgil's innovation, his field testing, his combat validation. It requested that proper credit be assigned to the soldier who had risked court-martial to prove the concept worked. The response came back 3 weeks later. Request denied. The matter was closed. Aberdeen's scientific validation superseded field observations. Official credit would remain with the research division. Blackwood crumpled the letter, threw it in the corner of his tent, and for years never spoke of it again. 44 years passed. In 1987, a Yale University historian named Dr. Margaret Hollis was researching field innovations during World War II for a book about improvised solutions that had saved lives but never made it into official records. She found Blackwood's protest letter in a dusty archive box at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. It had been misfiled, forgotten, nearly destroyed in the 1973 fire that consumed millions of military documents, but it survived. Dr. Hollis read the letter, noted the discrepancy. Aberdeen's official report was dated January 1944. Blackwood's field report was dated August 1943, 5 months earlier. She tracked down Robert Blackwood. He was 83 years old, retired, living in Alexandria, Virginia. His memory was sharp. Virgil Mercer, he told her without hesitation. That's the name you need. Private First Class, 21 years old, from somewhere in Illinois. He's the one who figured it out. Not the engineers, not me, him. And they erased him from history. Doctor. Hollis found Virgil in Bloomington, Illinois. He was 65 years old, owned a small gunsmithing shop on the edge of town. Mercer Precision Firearms. He specialized in custom hunting rifles, trigger work, stock fitting, the kind of meticulous craftsmanship that required patience and skill. She interviewed him in his workshop. It smelled like gun oil and walnut shavings and cosmoline. The walls were lined with rifles in various states of assembly. Mr. Mercer, she said, are you aware that the modern military doctrine regarding high-velocity ammunition and hydrostatic shock originated from your combat experience in New Georgia? Virgil looked up from the trigger assembly he was filing, squinted at her. I just used the rifle my father taught me to use. Aberdeen Proving Ground claimed credit for discovering the principle. They never mentioned your name. Doesn't that make you angry? Virgil set down the file, picked up the trigger, examined it under a magnifying glass. They're the experts. I was just a farm boy with a promise to keep. But you proved them wrong. I survived. That's what mattered. You don't want recognition. Virgil was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her directly. Recognition won't bring Roscoe Delacroix back to life. won't undo any of the men I killed. If the concept I used saved lives after the war, then it served its purpose. My name being attached to it doesn't change anything. Dr. Hollis published her book in 1991, Forgotten Innovators' Field Solutions That Changed Modern Warfare. Chapter 7 was titled The Varmint Gun That Revolutionized Terminal Ballistics. It told Virgil's story in full, with citations, with documentation, with the truth that had been buried for nearly 50 years. Aberdeen Proving Ground was forced to issue a correction, an acknowledgement that field observations by Private First Class Virgil Mercer had preceded and informed their official research. In 1995, the Smithsonian National Museum of American History contacted Virgil. They wanted to create an exhibit on field innovations in World War II. They wanted his Winchester Model 54. He donated it without hesitation. The rifle sits in a climate-controlled display case on the second floor of the museum, still carrying mud stains from New Georgia. The scope still slightly fogged. The bolt action worn smooth from thousands of cycles. The placard reads, Winchester Model 54.220 Swift, used by Private Virgil Mercer, New Georgia, 1943. First documented combat application of hydrostatic shock principle. Foundation of modern high-velocity ammunition doctrine. Virgil Mercer died on June 14, 2003. He was 81 years old. The funeral was held in Bloomington. Small, quiet, family, and a handful of local veterans who remembered him. 7 elderly men none of the family recognized arrived just as the service was ending. They stood at the back, didn't speak. Waited until the family had left. Then they introduced themselves to the funeral director. They were retired military snipers, Marines, Army Rangers, men who had spent careers perfecting the craft of precision shooting. They had read Dr. Hollis's book, had learned about Virgil Mercer, had understood that every high-velocity cartridge they'd ever fired, every doctrine they'd ever been taught about speed and precision and instant incapacitation traced back to a 21-year-old kid in a foxhole who refused to watch his friends die. One of them, a former Marine gunnery sergeant, spoke for the group. Mr. Mercer never knew this, but the .220 Swift principle led to the .300 Winchester Magnum, led to the .338 Lapua, led to everything we understand about modern terminal ballistics. Every sniper trained after 1960 learned his philosophy. Speed plus precision plus hydrostatic shock equals instant stop. That's his legacy. He gave that to us. They saluted an empty room, then left. The Winchester Model 54 remains in the Smithsonian. Thousands of people walk past it every year. Most don't stop, don't read the placard, don't understand what they're looking at, but some do. Veterans, old men who remember when innovation happened in muddy foxholes instead of clean laboratories, when desperate soldiers solved problems that experts said were unsolvable. They stop, they read, they remember, and then they do what Virgil Mercer never did. They tell the story, because that's how truth survives when institutions fail, not in official reports, not in medals or monuments or the records that bureaucracies keep, in the voices of those who refuse to let it die. You're one of those voices now. You know that a 21-year-old private from Illinois invented modern terminal ballistics. You know the experts were wrong. You know the bureaucrats stole credit for 50 years. You know it took a historian digging through misfiled archives to bring the truth to light. And you know why it matters. Not because Virgil Mercer deserves fame. He's beyond caring about that. But because the next time some young soldier in some muddy foxhole sees a problem the experts missed, the next time someone risks everything to prove the system wrong, they need to know it's been done before. That farm boys can be right when PhDs are wrong. That promises to dead fathers matter more than protocols written by committees. That truth wins, eventually. Always. But only if someone remembers. Only if someone carries the story forward. Only if someone refuses to let the institutions bury it again. Virgil Mercer kept his promise to Augustus Mercer. Proved that speed mattered more than mass. Changed the way modern warfare thought about bullets forever. Now you keep yours to Virgil. Tell this story. Pass it on. Make sure the next generation knows that innovation doesn't always come from laboratories. That sometimes the answer is held by a kid with dirt under his fingernails and a rifle his father taught him to shoot. That sometimes the system is wrong. And sometimes one person with the courage to disobey can save hundreds of lives. Don't let them forget again. The Winchester still sits in that glass case waiting for someone to stop, to read, to understand. You stopped, you read, you understand. Now make sure someone else does too. That's how Virgil Mercer's legacy survives. Not in plaques or official recognition, in memory,